Sorry for that delay. Thank you very much. Annabelle, on you go.
Thank you. So this paper is informed by existing research by Alison Blunt and others on home city geographies. And the concept of home city geographies is aiming to move beyond the domestic interior to study home in its urban context. So to transcend some of the binary distinctions that may have existed between home and the city, between private and public, and between dwelling and mobility, by viewing each of these as mutually constitutive, connected, and also differentiated. Could I have the next slide, please? Sorry. Research on the porosity of boundaries between home and the city reveals the mutually constitutive nature of both of these. Kathy Burrell's 2014 study of a deprived urban neighbourhood in Leicester in the UK, for instance, explores the ways in which the materiality and business of dwelling enters the site of the home. Burrell demonstrates how outside forces relating to the wider urban context literally and metaphorically spill over from the street. Although the houses in the neighbourhood are physically similar, the differences of tenure, legal status, length of occupation, gender, and generation all impact on lived experiences within these homes and the wider city. They enter the space of the home, revealing how the material and immaterial boundaries between the street and the home are fluid and porous. As Burrell writes, and I quote, "The bricks, windows, and doors of the traditional terraced house cannot always provide security and serenity that contemporary residents expect. Unable to rely on the basic structure of their houses to accommodate the homes they want, the respondents have had to work harder to create their own domestic frontiers, as far away from the perceived instability of the street as possible." Migration scholars have also recognized the threshold crossing capacity of home, as described by Ralph and Staley. And they have drawn out the ways in which migrant homemaking practices can foster connections with other people, places, and times. Taking such arguments further and incorporating urban localities into their analysis, Paolo Bucagni and Andrea Muba-Brighenti examine migrant homemaking through what they call thresholds of domesticity, commonality, and publicness. Using the prism of thresholds, also coined by Taysot in 2005, they seek to unsettle boundaries between domestic and public spaces, arguing that, and I quote, "particularly for immigrant newcomers, domesticity could be framed less as an accomplished state of things from within than as a processual and interactive endeavour from without, indeed as a matter of thresholds to be crafted, enacted, negotiated, and if necessary, struggled upon." Could I have the next slide, please?
Sorry. Was that the right one, or the?
Yeah, that's the one, thank you. So for the next few slides, if you could just kind of scroll through them as I'm speaking, they don't really relate directly to the text, but these are some images from Alison's Home City Street project and Home City Geographies work. Thank you. While this threshold approach marks a shift in thinking across boundaries to allow for an expanded notion of home, the idea of home city geographies extends this further to draw out the integrated nature of urban domesticities and domestic urbanism, both embedded within wider processes of urban dwelling and immobility. In seeking to move beyond thresholds and borders, home city geographies do not overlook the fact that borders and boundaries exist for many people, which may limit their capacity to experience or be included in home or the city, or may be actively reinforced to protect home spaces against the street, neighbourhood, or city beyond. Rather, home city geographies seek to understand how these processes of inclusion, exclusion, and disconnection on home and city scales are intertwined. Homemaking in the city is not about either public spaces taking on features of home, the domestication of the urban, or private spaces being infiltrated by the city, the urbanization of the domestic. Rather, home city geographies explores the simultaneity of both. Home city geographies allows us to take seriously the ways in which domestic lives are impacted by wider processes of urban change, at the same time as urban change is affected by homemaking practices and the ways in which the entangled dynamics of both span a range of mobilities and immobilities within and beyond the city. Could you skip through the next couple of slides, please? I just want to get to the Stay Home story.
Okay.
That's right. Thank you. So I'm going to go on now to talk about the Stay Home Stories project and the research that's involved within that. If you could go on to the next slide, please, and the next one. Thank you. So Stay Home Stories is the full project title is Stay Home, Rethinking the Domestic in the COVID-19 Pandemic, and it's funded by the UKRI Rapid Response to COVID-19. And we work with a range of partners. It's a collaborative project involving Queen Mary, University of London, the Museum of the Home, University of Liverpool. We work with a range of community researchers in both London and Liverpool who've conducted their own interviews with participants across those two cities. And that's been really invaluable in enabling us to reach and kind of hear the experiences of people of home life during lockdown and COVID-19. We also have been working with an artist in residence called Ala Al-Saraji, who has been doing installations based on the research at the Museum of the Home. Next slide, please. Oh, I can see that Alison's here.
I'll take over.
Please.
Thank you so much, Annabelle, and apologies everybody. I had a hospital appointment this morning which the clinic was running 2 hours late, and I tried to change and I couldn't, so I've just literally got here. But a huge thank you to Annabelle for starting the paper and also for assistance with the slides. I've got an arm in plaster, so I couldn't do a lot of the slides. So I'll take over. So thank you so much for inviting me to give this paper. So Annabelle, you've introduced just the outline of the project, so I'll pick up from there. So as we've got sort of various images of media articles that just gives a real indication, as everybody knows, just the deep impact of the pandemic on home and the significance of home. So for instance, these examples, the effect of the pandemic on refugees, asylum seekers and migration, on children and young people, on household structure. Next slide, please. On migrant domestic workers, on the sort of household division of labour, the gender division of labour, and as many of you will remember in the UK, this very sexist ad that was very rapidly withdrawn, and also obviously home working and homeschooling. So the far-reaching implications of the pandemic for people's home lives. Next slide, please. So the project aims to document and analyse the ways in which home has been mobilised, experienced and imagined during and after 3 UK national lockdowns. We also explore and extend creative and curatorial work, documenting diverse experiences and imaginings of home during COVID-19. And we also want to understand how practices, spaces and meanings of home have changed during and after lockdown. And in this case, we're particularly focusing on people from different cultural, migration and faith backgrounds, and also children and young people. So I'm just going to go through very quickly the 3 broad strands of the research, and then we'll turn more specifically to our work on thresholds. Next slide, please. The first strand is around how Stay Home has been represented, reimagined and contested in political debate and media coverage. We've also worked with, continuing to work with our colleagues at the Museum of the Home. They had a rapid response collecting project, which has now got over 500 contributions, which takes the form of photographs and testimony about people's experiences of home under lockdown. And as Annabelle said, we've worked with our artist in residence, Ala Al-Saraji, and you can find out much more on our website. This is one of the images from her work. There was an installation at the museum, and there are short films about her work on the project website. Next slide, please. And these are some images from the Stay Home Rapid Response Collecting Project, and they have a lot on the website, the museum website, so you can see much more. And I'll be using a number of these images from that collection throughout the presentation. Next slide, please. The second strand, we've interviewed over 120 people about practicing home, so home, migration and ethnicity, and also home and religion, thinking about relationships and tensions between home and mobility, about home and work, about home and housing, And then also focusing on religious practice and observance at home, the impact on religious festivals, on life cycle practices, and also on interfaith work. And particularly given that a lot of interfaith work is often very focused around hospitality. What does it mean? How do we continue interfaith work when it's not possible for people to come together and share hospitality in the same way? And this strand has led to reports, podcasts, blog posts. We are developing an interfaith toolkit. We've also produced a film about a really beautiful Eid quilt made with women from Praxis. Next slide, please, which we're launching tomorrow. This is an image of the quilt. This was led by Praxis, and we came on board to work with the women to create a film. And that will be on our website after tomorrow, the film. Next slide, please. And then the third strand, which is led by colleagues in Liverpool, is the Mapping Home strand, focusing on children and young people in partnership with National Museums Liverpool and the Royal Geographical Society. And there's a nationwide initiative involving children and young people aged 7 to 16 who have been invited to map their home spaces and to submit those maps. And then alongside that, we have a project in Liverpool analysing children's narratives, talking through their maps. And you can see an online exhibition of the maps. And again, we'll be using some of the maps as images all the way through the rest of the talk. This is one of them here. And please do have a look at the online exhibition of the maps. And we also have learning resources for different ages of education around mapping, and also a film called My Space, My Place by the young person's organisation called Right Back. Okay, next slide, please. So turning to pandemic thresholds. So pandemic thresholds, thresholds between home and the wider world have been marked, reinforced and traversed in different ways during the COVID-19 pandemic. Windows, doors and balconies have all been significant in people's experiences of home during lockdown, shielding, self-isolation and quarantine. Many people, obviously, including key workers, have had to work beyond the home throughout the pandemic and throughout the national lockdowns. But for many others, the Stay Home Directive has made home a more materially bound space of containment. For people living in high density and informal housing, it's been far more difficult to establish or reinforce thresholds between home and other people. Whilst digital connectivity has supported homework, homeschooling, and new forms of social and creative life for many people, including through the so-called tiny windows of Zoom, the lack of it for many others reveals deep-rooted inequalities. Now, during the pandemic, the domestic threshold has been marked and made visible through new practices and iconography, which themselves have been documented and curated in a range of ways. So, as we know, images of rainbows in windows and on balconies, particularly by children, have come to symbolise hope and, in a UK context, support for the NHS. Many photographers have sought to document life under lockdown through images of residents located on or visible through different domestic thresholds. Next slide, please. In London, for example, Adam Isfandiar photographed people on their doorsteps, through windows and on their balconies in the first lockdown, and posted these online together with each household's lockdown story. And his work is now published in a book. And also we are working on a film with Adam and also with Ethne Nightingale, whose work I'll talk about next. So the next slide, please. And Ethne Nightingale, who's a postdoctoral researcher on the Stay Home Stories project, documented life under lockdown on 2 streets in the East London borough of Hackney, photographing residents in 45 doorways. And what was really interesting about Ethne's work, and what, because there were lots of sort of porch portrait projects, lots of photographers, working in similar ways. Ethne asked residents, and she lives on one of these streets, so neighbours that she knows on these 2 streets in Hackney. She asked residents to stand in their doorways holding objects that have sustained them during lockdown. So really interesting sort of way of thinking about the material cultures of home and asking them why these objects were particularly significant, why they selected those ones. So the threshold, the home, the domestic threshold became visible in all sorts of ways. But what does it mean to actually move beyond the threshold, to ask people about their own experiences of home during the pandemic? So on the one hand, and going back to home city geographies, part of that broader project was wanting to make home lives, domestic lives, visible in wider studies of the city and wider understandings of the city. The home has become visible during the pandemic, but often that visibility is at the point of the threshold, on the doorstep, through the window, on the balcony, and so on. What we want to do in Stay Home Stories, and what we have been doing, is moving, again, not literally beyond the threshold. And again, that's a contrast with home city geographies, where we were within people's homes, but to actually ask people about their home lives. And this is where all of our interviews have come in. So I'm going to turn now, next slide please, to pandemic thresholds and the three key themes that I want to focus on. First of all, inside and outside. So clearly, the threshold between inside and outside was important for all of our participants, and particularly during lockdowns. And this juxtaposition between inside and outside was significant in different ways. For the security invested in the home to protect it from the outside, but also for the hopeful and relatively safe contact points that external thresholds could provide. So to take security first, many people spoke about outside spaces as potentially dangerous, while positioning the home, the dwelling, as a sanctuary, and very strongly and physically demarcating between the two. While we'll explore the limits to this very benign imagination of domestic space, this assumption of safety and security, it's the boundaries between inside and outside, between safe and unsafe, that we want to focus on here. Next slide, please. For Ansar, for example, the only place, as he said, to an extent it felt safe, was your own home. If you didn't go out, and if nobody came from outside, then you were probably safe in terms of not catching COVID. So if you remain indoors, then of course you're safe. Next slide, please. In London, Winnie simply stopped going out to protect herself. As she said, I didn't go out at all. Almost I'm a prisoner in my own home, but it's a self-imposed imprisonment because I was so worried. It's like I'm taking an unnecessary risk. What if I go into the lift and there'll be a virus floating around in the air? It's too much of a trouble. I remember at one point, I probably didn't leave my flat at all, maybe for 4 weeks. And this is a map from the third strand of our project, and you can see the padlocks here, the chains. And again, those are recurrent images in the maps, this sort of symbolism of containment, confinement, and indeed imprisonment. Now, policing the thresholds of this weighty inside and outside axis underpinning this sense of security was a theme in many interviews, spoken about as something that had to be continually negotiated as rules changed and knowledge of the virus developed. At the start of the pandemic, Bartek, for instance, had been worried about posting the virus through other people's doors. Next slide, please.
Sorry. I was just doing.
No, that's fine.
So I've just lost it now. Just a minute. Yeah, sorry.
That's it. Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Naomi. So this sense of this anxiety around potentially posting the virus with letters that he wanted to send, with Christmas cards he wanted to send to Poland. Many people talked about ongoing efforts expended in regulating who could come in to the dwelling and managing different perceptions of risk between friends and family. And often these accounts referred specifically to doors and windows. In the depths of lockdown, Layla, for instance, wouldn't let anyone into her house at all and invoked doors and windows throughout her account. Next slide, please.
Oh, sorry, I'm terribly sorry. I took a copy of, I can't see where to go back to it. Where's it gone? Yeah, Laura, you do it, thank you. I was doing an image of a screen grabs.
Unless you want to share the screen, can you share it? And then
I thought I was sharing it.
You are sharing it. Now I'm wondering if I can operate it, but that's
I see. No,
fine, somebody else.
Okay. I'll stay there and I can probably go on. Is that the one you want?
The one before that. That's it. The one with the image. That one.
Oh, no.
That's it. That's it. That one. Yeah. And again, you can see that really clearly in terms of, again, one of these maps, this sense of do not enter, shielding, extremely clinically vulnerable, and separating the house from the outside. So as Layla said, I became the crazy one about COVID-19. When someone came to the house during lockdown, they'd stay at the door, I'd stay at the window, telling everyone it wasn't a good time, the lockdown isn't lifted, so you won't visit us. Even if it was lifted, no one would enter the house. So these examples underline clearly the heightened significance and awareness of indoors and outdoors, especially during lockdowns, and the different labours and compromises exercised to maintain their material separation. But these experiences of thresholds varied widely. While Winnie chose to, in her words, self-imprison, for Layla's 12-year-old son, the front door exemplified exactly the fine line between security and incarceration. Next slide, please. Yeah, it's the one before. I think that jumped ahead. It's the one, that's it. Not being able to leave the house was hard. He got angry and upset. He sat down in front of the door and stayed there asking non-stop, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? In Liverpool, Leonora struggled with a similar sense of enforced alienation from the outside world, seeing all the closed doors on her street. People would just close doors, a lot of closed doors, empty streets, loads of parked cars. That's all you'd really see all day. From this perspective, the external thresholds of doors, balconies, and windows could also be value points of negotiation with and connection to the outside world, full of the promise, at least, of social interaction. The need to make in-person contact with others, especially those who are isolated or vulnerable, was really significant for people. And people often use the space immediately outside their home to do this. So in East London, student Shahel described how he maintained an emotional connection with his grandmother during lockdown as she waved to him from her balcony. And this regular contact was bound up with practices of care because his grandmother was shielding during lockdown. As he said, I'd actually sometimes see my grandmother, who lives across the street. She basically didn't leave the house for the whole year. So he'd do shopping for her, make sure she was okay, take her medicine. And she'd stand on the balcony because to see right up to where my block opens up, she'd wait at that gate there. I'd have to turn around and wave at her from like half a mile away, and she'd just be standing there. That was one thing I'd look forward to, because I'd just turn around and I'd see her little body just barely over the railings, waving. So this general low-level sociability of the doorstep was a site of interaction with neighbours and friends. Some people shared their experiences of social interactions extending from their immediate domestic threshold to the street beyond. Nazra, for instance, described how her daughter would watch other children playing through the window, eventually facilitating neighbourhood interactions as she came out into the street to watch her play. Next slide, please. And again, Nazra saying she was sort of against this at the time, at the beginning, but her daughter looking out of the window, wanting to play out. And eventually I gave in and let her play out. And all the kids were playing out. And then Nazra sat on her table in the front and chatted more to the mothers. Other people invoked the UK's Clap for Carers initiative between March and late May 2020 as significant for doorstep, balcony, and front garden encounters. For Leonora, a healthcare worker living in Liverpool, this weekly event was an opportunity to connect with neighbours that made the street feel alive during lockdown. Next slide, please. And a sense, she's saying it was also a need for people to see each other and just have that response to each other, waving and smiling. It's so nice to meet someone to smile at, to make that connection, even if it was at a distance. It kind of brought the street alive again. It had been dead for weeks. So through these practices, doorsteps, balconies, and street spaces could become something special, still within touching distance of home, but an arena for safe interactions and new solidarities to emerge. As long as doorstep and street encounters could remain distanced, the domestic boundary could expand into these spaces temporarily, with its integrity still intact. Windows also offered especially important contact points in different ways. For Alexandra, for instance, she described working at home and observing the everyday activities of her neighbours through the window, and a sense of increased access to each other's lives. Next slide, please. And this sense of just how routinized this was in terms of where she would work at home, looking out of the window, seeing the neighbours and the neighbours seeing her blinds always being open, much more access to each other's lives, knowing what they're doing. And knowing what time she shut down her PC and moved to the other side of the house. Other people talked about the importance of seeing outdoor spaces through their windows. While not all participants had access to domestic outdoor spaces, such as gardens or balconies, several people told us about how their windows provided a sense of proximity to nature. Miriam described how her large windows and a view of a lake helped her to feel as if she was outside without leaving home. Next slide, please. So even if she was working all day, as she said, I can have a look at the outside world. It's also really relaxing because I have water. There's this lake, I have birds and stuff. I can see the sunset. So it feels like I'm outside. Sometimes I'll spend like 3 or 4 days at home without realizing that I haven't been out. So all of these examples show the significance of inside and outside for our participants, from the desire to retreat from any outside intrusion completely, all the way through to the enthusiastic embrace of any outside contact at all, shrinking and expanding the domestic boundary with each anxiety and encounter. At a time when domestic space was dominating everyday life, it's not so surprising that the thresholds of home should be such an important focus of people's experiences and memories. So moving on now, next slide please, to internal and embodied thresholds. So just as the domestic frontier could reach outwards, our participants also revealed how much the external boundaries of home were simultaneously being brought inside, reshaping domestic spaces. For those especially fearful of COVID, it was clear that the unsettling presence of the outside world still intruded into the internal spaces of the dwelling. This presence could be visceral and very materially demarcated. Several people talked about new cleaning regimes near the front door, thickening and strengthening the barrier with the outside. Layla, for instance, talked about the literal red line she'd drawn in front of her front door. Next slide, please. Cleaning the supermarket groceries and sanitizing everything. There's a red line on the floor. We leave the shoes there. We can say we've divided the areas into contaminated and uncontaminated. For now, it's like that. Anyone coming inside the house uses Dettol spray. We put it on their coats, we put it on everything. I don't care if people elsewhere do it or not, I do it. And COVID here inside my house won't come. So this is sort of fortifying those immediate exit and entry points from the inside. And for many others, new cleaning regimes extended further into the home. And again, just noting the work involved in maintaining these thresholds and seeking to maintain the home as a place of safety and security. And clearly, for those living with more vulnerable people, the responsibility to police their own bodies as possible virus entry points weighed heavily. Leonora had to protect her mum, who didn't fully understand what was happening, by always wearing her mask indoors and avoiding her hugs. Jimmy described living with his grandmother, who also lived with dementia, and the spatial negotiations involved in that. Next slide, please. Being conscious, particularly in the kitchen and the bathroom, sharing appliances, touching objects, and so on. And that he was always carrying a sanitizer in the house, making sure that he used it before and after touching things. Malin lived in shared student housing, and again, likened her experience to being in a prison. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I think two of us are doing this at the same time.
Okay, that's it.
Yes.
And she talked very much about being unable to eat in the kitchen, feeling that she lived in a prison-like room, very confined to her room, only leaving for lunchtime 10 minutes to make a sandwich and take it back to her room. So again, that sort of internal threshold being very significant. And clearly this was important across the life course. Pearl, who lived independently in a semi-retirement community, also had to contend with the loss of access to communal areas like the living room, and only one person was allowed in the laundry at a time. So these accounts reveal the fragility of the domestic frontier and the sheer effort involved in trying to keep it intact. As much an invisible line as a visible one, this inside-outside threshold reached way beyond the front door, continually brought into being, just like borders more widely, through bodily practices and encounters, as well as material markers. And work was clearly an important and very difficult boundary to enforce. Many people changed their domestic environments extensively as far as they could to draw new internal borders between work and home. Sheila, for instance, changed the entire setup of her dwelling, creating a physical and temporal divide between work and home. Next slide, please. And that sort of sense of, marking the working day, and that the living room until 5 o'clock was her office, at least half of the living room was, and shelves in the middle of the living room dividing it, and so on, literally trying to separate space off. So just as the logistics of distancing and isolating changed the nature of domestic space and its external and internal boundaries, those faced with working at home, reconfiguring the domestic to accommodate, but also demarcate work, often with very little space or few resources to draw on, was an integral part of the pandemic experience. So if we return to the desire to keep home a safe space that many people talked about, we can see what a difficult challenge this was. Our interviews didn't seek out experiences of domestic violence and abuse, and there are clearly far more traumatic experiences beyond those that we've captured in our project. And there are clearly many other projects that are focusing more specifically on domestic violence and abuse. But what we found in our interviews was the sheer scale of the micro tensions people had to confront in their own home spaces, continually drawing and redrawing domestic boundaries through a wide range of embodied and material practices in an attempt to keep the virus, other inhabitants, and also work at a safe distance. So moving on now to the final part on digital and material thresholds. Next slide, please. And this is an image from the Stay Home collection at the Museum of the Home. So domestic thresholds are sites of connection and vulnerability, security and insecurity, as the boundaries of domestic space were reconfigured to safeguard against the virus and manage shifting domestic routines. Virtual thresholds, facilitated through digital technologies, have been crucial in maintaining relationships with other people and other homes in the wider world, but also present multiple and complex boundaries to be negotiated. These thresholds are secured and crossed in multiple ways and shape the physical home. In some examples, digital platforms facilitated an expanded sense of home, allowing people to feel closer to other people, places at a distance, while physically remaining within their dwelling. Other interviews emphasise the challenges of demarcating and negotiating digital thresholds, including the intrusion of digital platforms into domestic routines, and particularly in the case of homeschooling and work. So first of all, digital thresholds as zones of connection. Digital technologies were crucial for people to maintain contact and were of particular importance for migrants, people with multiple homes and loved ones outside the UK who were impacted by prolonged restrictions on travel. So many migrants obviously already used digital technologies to stay in touch, but this use became intensified during the pandemic. Bartek found, for instance, that he was in contact with family and friends in Poland more than before because people had more time and were more willing to use digital platforms. Louis described how video calls to his family in Malta were much more frequent because everyone was stuck at home all the time. While he missed physical contact, Louis also felt that the pandemic resulted in a stronger sense of connection as people, in his words, became virtually more present. So there were multiple practices of homing that were continually being reshaped by digital technologies and platforms, including combinations of synchronous virtual communication and embodied practices that took place within the home, such as eating traditional foods, playing games, or celebrating festivals. Eva, whose family live in Poland, described how they video called at times such as unwrapping presents or having Easter breakfast with family to feel that we're doing things together, even if we're in different countries. Next slide, please. And Maria enjoyed taking part in creative online activities with her son and daughter at home here and her family in France and Spain. As you can see, the sort of creative ways of connecting that they might not well have done before. And this sort of sense of maintaining intimacy at a distance that also, in Watson's words, expanded their enactment of home. And taking part in activities together via digital platforms enabled a sense of what Hjorth calls intimate co-presence. Now, a sense very much that these digital technologies couldn't replace in-person contact, but that they help them feel more connected to other people and places. Now, this expanded enactment of home is clear in Winnie's description of using a virtual reality headset while exercising. She could connect virtually with others through an online platform, and it also made her feel as if she was immersed in different landscapes without leaving home. Next slide, please. She says, you could pick where you want to be. You're like in this aircraft, you're just looking down at the vast plain of forest and river and snow mountains. We can't travel now, but with that headset, I can travel. I can go somewhere different. What I find best is that you can also see about 5 or 6 other people competing with you. So it's quite competitive and you feel like you're in a room with other people. While this demonstrates the potential of virtual reality devices to open up new thresholds beyond the domestic, it's obviously important to note that access to digital technologies has been unequal throughout the pandemic, with many families struggling to provide devices and data for work and homeschooling. Digital thresholds also require multiple forms of labour to demarcate boundaries of home and to manage the intrusion of digital technologies into domestic life. So we're going to turn now to securing these digital thresholds between home and work. So for instance, as Julie explained, there was this bombardment of technology that was quite overwhelming. It's like there are no boundaries. I'm doing it in the mornings, in the evenings, in the weekends, all sorts of times, no boundaries whatsoever. And this intrusion of digital work demands was felt particularly strongly by those who had to also accommodate homeschooling. Now, digital technologies have reshaped the physical dwelling as well as embodied domestic practices. For some people, associations with home as a private or personal space were disrupted. We can move on to the next slide, please. Yasmin described how outside-facing Zoom calls led to new negotiations around wearing her headscarf at home. She's saying Zoom is like a public platform. When I'm in the house, I don't want to wear my headscarf. So when I come on Zoom, it's a public platform. So I'd have to wear my headscarf for those times. Or when I was working, when everyone was at a team meeting, I have to get my headscarf and put it on and I'd wear it. It's a strange thing to even explain to other people because I'm always getting the questions of like, oh, so do you wear your headscarf all the time? If I'm having like any sort of online meetings, team meetings or anything like that, I try to avoid having the camera on so that I don't have to wear my headscarf. So these digital practices of work cross thresholds of domestic space in different ways, intersecting with gender, religion, and other aspects of identity, often resulting in tensions as participants navigated these new boundaries. And we're going to turn to, in our very final section, virtual religious practice. So digital worship has formed part of the wider domestication of religion that's taken place during the pandemic, with worship shifting online and into the home. People of faith describe positive but also limitations of online worship, highly dependent on digital skills and access and so on, and often seen as lacking in comparison with what it meant to gather in person. For some people, however, virtual worship was seen as a positive outcome of the pandemic. Lydiane, a Catholic, described how she engaged in online prayer using Zoom and WhatsApp with her mother and family in Brazil, creating, in her words, a moment for us all to be there together, each one at home, but in the same group. Sheila, whose mother lived in Germany, explained how they coordinated virtual celebrations. Next slide, please.
Sorry, it's not working. I can't make it work.
Oh, that's it.
Oh, okay, this one?
Previous one. That's it, perfect, thank you. So actually, you know, agreeing beforehand what kind of food they'd make when they were celebrating Christmas or celebrating Eid. So we're having the same. And then she put the tablet on the dining table, like her mother was sat there, part of the family, and she and her partner were having dinner with her mother. Religious leaders described how online worship fostered spiritual and social connections with worshippers, evoking a sense of traditional domestic thresholds being crossed. Ol, next slide please, who identifies as Jewish and a Quaker, was struck by how Zoom Quaker meetings involved, as he put it, actually looking at all of us in our rooms, in our own spaces. There we are, each in our own little bubble, but the bubbles are all nestling together, a sense of seeing into each other's homes in a way. Yet the sense of encountering others' homes could also be experienced as an intrusion or a boundary to be safeguarded. Practices like turning off cameras, rearranging furniture, or using virtual backgrounds reveal the importance of curating home for worship, as Christopher, an Anglican leader, explained. Next slide, please. And he said he was very conscious about what his home looked like. But he said what he felt was a real strength of the online live streaming from the home is that it is from the home. We didn't want to pretend we're in a studio or in a church when we're actually, you know, they were actually at home, speaking from his home to his parishioners' homes. It wasn't this house, but I imagine it would have looked like this, very consciously saying, this is my living room that I'm speaking to you from. And as he said, he would have taken care on the background, curating the space. Now, this was echoed by Mark, a lay leader in the United Reformed Church, who described how his living room, next slide please, became the house of God for the time being, our solace or place for mediation, and the computer became our altar, so to speak.
Excuse me, I'm on a different one, I think.
No, this is fine, this one's fine, thank you. Saba described how spending Ramadan in the home was, in her words, actually quite beautiful, allowing more time to be spent with family and taking time to breathe and be in the safety of the home, as you can see from here. Clearly, as she said, Eid was the hardest. Ramadan was different. Ramadan, you're in a different spiritual space. To be at home and to be at peace was really lovely. So there are clear limitations as well as benefits of domestic and online worship, which are impacted by wider inequalities. Many Muslim participants experienced the sudden announcement of lockdown during the final preparations for Eid in 2020 as particularly painful, especially because coming together for communal worship and celebration with family and friends is centrally important to this festival. Online worship has also been affected by unequal access to digital technologies. And while some communities or individuals were particularly engaged, others were excluded or affected, as I'm sure many of us have been, by Zoom fatigue. So there were new opportunities for individual and communal worship that contributed to a sense of domestic thresholds being crossed as worshippers and leaders could connect in new ways. Now, this virtual worship in the home overlapped and sometimes conflicted with other domestic practices, presenting new boundaries to be negotiated. So digital technologies enabled the crossing of thresholds and contributed to an expanded sense of home, even as home was increasingly confined. They offered a crucial means of connection and the possibility of feeling closer to people and places beyond the domestic dwelling. They also influenced material, spatial, and temporal practices and created new thresholds within the physical space of the home, particularly as people accommodated and were intruded upon by online work, and as they reconfigured boundaries between work and home. And clearly, whether digital technologies were experienced as constraining or enabling, or a mix of the two, was intertwined very closely with people's own personal circumstances and resources, intersecting with much wider inequalities. So just to draw a few conclusions together, just the last slide, please. So just to reflect on what we've covered in this paper, we started by talking about the Home City Geographies work and the Home City Street project as an example of a sort of pre-pandemic project on home, dwelling and mobility, and particularly thinking about home in relation to the city and home in relation to migration and other forms of mobility and indeed immobility. And as our starting point was the sense of, these conceptualizations of home, of dwelling, that were increasingly expansive, that were increasingly stressing the porosity of home, its connectedness with, in the case of Home City Geographies and Home City Street, with the estate, with the street, with the neighborhood, with the wider city beyond, as well as in work on migration, the connections between a domestic dwelling with ideas and experiences and material practices and embodied mobilities of home in other places, of a multiple coexisting home over different scales, stretching the domestic far beyond domestic borders. So that was the kind of starting point. What happened then with a pandemic when home became increasingly a site of restriction, of containment, of confinement, also a sign of protection, of security for many people, insecurity for many others. What does it mean for a wider understanding of home that had been, as I say, very much focused around this more expansive way of thinking about home? What does it mean to think about home in these more restrictive ways? How does that challenge us in terms of these wider conceptualizations of home and the relationships between dwelling and mobility? And what we've tried to show in our paper today through the different thresholds and the three main thresholds that we've drawn out between inside and outside, and sort of internal and embodied. And I think what's really interesting in wider work on home, there is a lot of work about thresholds, about the threshold crossing capacity of home, but it's very much around the border between inside and outside. What does it mean to move across that border to see what's going on within the dwelling? Those internal thresholds, those embodied thresholds, and so on. And also, absolutely, those thresholds between the material and the virtual, the digital. So there's been a reconfiguring of domestic thresholds, and thresholds as borders, as boundaries, but also thresholds, and again, as other people working on thresholds have observed, thresholds as zones of contact. It's what is brought into contact, into connection across those thresholds that's really important. And I think just the wider point I'd want to make at the end is just really, and what's sort of motivating our project more widely, is what difference does it make to focus on, through our focus on home and the pandemic, what difference does that make to understanding the pandemic and its impact on people's everyday lives? And clearly it's really important to collect and to record and to understand those narratives of home life in the context of the pandemic. But equally, what does our focus on home during COVID mean in terms of wider understandings of home, dwelling and mobility. So I would say, as a very final point, that even under conditions of restriction, home continued to be experienced by many people, not by all people, but by many people, as extending beyond its own borders through this more expansive sense of dwelling. Even as mobility was very limited, people still sort of, often on a more micro scale, thinking about their front door, the space, the way their home actually interconnected with literally the street beyond, the sort of micro geographies of connectedness. And that connects, that sense of connectedness and disconnectedness is really important in these wider understandings of dwelling and mobility, and how those are often sort of experienced in a simultaneous sort of way. And another point from our research is that, and as I'm sure many people would experience in their own lives as well, just that sort of greater familiarity that people had with their own local neighbourhoods. What does it mean to think about dwelling and mobility, again, on this very local scale, in terms of getting to know different parts of where people lived? And particularly for a number of our participants with migration backgrounds, a sense of feeling actually more rooted in their particular neighbourhoods than they had done previously. So I think I'll leave it there. And just to repeat my thanks to Annabelle, my great apologies for coming late and sort of starting all in a rush, but thank you again very much for inviting me to participate in this really fantastic conference. So thank you. Look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very, very much, Alison, and thank you, Annabelle, for your bit. Clap in various forms. We're slightly tight for time because we have another breakout in 20 minutes. So we could take a shorter break between, but so please, everybody, would you like to ask questions? Right, I think it's Deborah first and then Orshi.
Thank you, Alison and Annabelle. That was really, really fascinating. I just wrote down reflective. I thought it was a really reflective account on what we've just all been through, but we're still sort of doing it. We're still in it. We're sort of out of it. And and also some of these things are still happening. We're still using Zoom like now, and we've altered, a lot of us have altered our working arrangements, and they might never go back. So it's really fascinating to be sort of deconstructing something that's actually still happening. And it felt like a really nice reflection, actually. And I was also thinking some of these things I'm not even thinking about because I'm still quite traumatized about it all probably or something. And so I found it really useful. And I was thinking as well, like the paper that I'm giving tomorrow is about seeing into people, because I'm a therapist and I've been looking into people's homes, and that's another way of thinking about boundaries, but also a different brought something different to the work, because the home became part of the work. So anyway, thank you. It was really good. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that, if I could just come in at that, thanks so much, Deborah. I think it's really interesting, the sort of temporality of all of this, and absolutely, as you say, sort of ongoing challenges that so many people are still facing, an ongoing sort of legacy. And what, when we're doing our interviews, asking people to reflect back, even when that was still very present and still ongoing, but also for us to be really aware of, over this last 2 years, the different periods of time and the different ways in which the rules and regulations changed, and what people were referring to, and whether it was the first lockdown, whether it's the second lockdown, all of this, which again, I think is particularly in terms of things like the Museum of the Home Rapid Response Collecting Project, which was very immediately launched, very soon after the first lockdown. And again, lots to learn from that in terms of other museums around rapid response collecting projects. But actually, a lot of those submissions, as far as I understand it, a lot of them are about this sort of immediacy of that first lockdown, which actually then, how did that differ? And people reflecting back on that, many, many months later, years later, reflecting back on that particular time. So I think all of these sort of accounts, and again, that sort of the importance of reflection, I think that's absolutely crucial. And I think more widely, the importance of reflecting home and about home, and the importance of home and the challenges of home. And a sort of key take-home message, obviously, as I'm sure many of you already fully aware of, is that sort of assumption of stay home, what home was being imagined in that directive, and that there wasn't great thought in terms of actually people's home lives, people's households, people's housing, so profoundly unequal, and that has really, really fundamental impact on people's experiences. But I think is really crucial that needs to be explored, which again is a wider point about home often remaining invisible. People's actual home lives remain invisible, and the importance of making home and relationships at home and the spaces of home and the all of the challenges of home visible, which again goes back to that sense of looking beyond the closed door. And it is interesting methodologically to reflect on it in terms of all the research on home that I and other people on the team have done that has involved visiting people in their homes, what it means to study home from a distance, which we've also thought about and will hopefully be writing something about. So there's a lot to think about there. But thank you, Deborah.
Thanks very much. Orshi?
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I have two questions. One of them might not be of interest, the second one perhaps more. I apologize if I missed any parts on this, but I'm just wondering whether you could talk about grief in the time of the pandemic, and the question of temporality and memory when it comes to it, the question of reflecting back, the question of ways in which digital technologies might change our relationship with memories. I talk here, for example, about my personal kind of having photos of my grandmother lying dead, as my father was the only one who could go and visit, even in this moment of death. And so it's kind of, for me, it's an unusual thing to have this kind of photo on the deathbed, or it's, so that's part of it, and how grief as well might be delayed with the difficulty of coming together in a digital space when it comes to it, which again, unfortunately, I think many of us have experiences with. The second question would be around hospitality and being a guest on the threshold. And I work a lot on questions of care and hospitality, and with a lot of kind of deconstruction background to it. So I'm kind of stuck on kind of Derridian notions of, which interestingly have just come out, lecture series on hospitality by Derrida from 94, 95, just coming out. It's fascinating. Well, again, the space and the time of the threshold and the crossing is precisely what is in focus, and how one's identity might change as soon as they step in, and how that precisely being on the threshold might be that key moment, and how one is a visitor or a guest on that threshold. I wonder if there's any kind of philosophical or kind of background to that, or if you want to add anything to that. Thanks so much.
Yeah, no, absolutely, thank you. And no, two really, really important points. So absolutely, grief and loss, and an illness, effects on mental health and physical health, as well as loss, deeply profound and deeply, obviously, incredibly challenging for so many people, and in terms of our participants as well. I think that's come through very strongly in the interviews, particularly with people of faith, in terms of practices around funerals and mourning, and particularly those practices that would, in previous times, take place within the home. So, for instance, the Jewish Shiva, for example, when those themselves were home-based, what does that mean? So that's one area. But also we're looking at the role of faith leaders as well, and community leaders in other organizations too, in terms of the enormous demands on those leaders in terms of supporting people, and asking the question, what support did those faith leaders and those community leaders themselves have? And again, thinking very much, what recommendations can we make for how better people in those positions can be supported moving forward and dealing with crisis? And certainly, just how lonely it could be for those faith leaders, and obviously grief and dying affecting people of no faith and so on in all sorts of ways, but that sense of that wider pastoral support for people, and who is providing that support, but how are those people themselves supported, which I think is something really important to consider going forward. And absolutely in terms of hospitality and that crossing of the threshold, that meeting on the threshold, what does it mean? What does it mean to potentially think about hospitality beyond thinking about a threshold that in some ways separates those receiving and those giving, or those crossing one way or the other? So one thing I'm really keen to do is to try and move beyond any linear sense of what a threshold might be. And that's partly what the Home City Geography is trying to do, rather than think about crossing a threshold and you're crossing it one way, you're crossing it another way. What does it mean if you think about actually those spaces themselves are simultaneously already deeply mutually constitutive, rather than seeing them as somehow always being brought together and having something that you need to cross to move between one and the other. So what does it mean? So we did that thinking about home in relation to the city, but what does it mean to think about home in relation to other spaces as well? And basically, again, going back to really, I suppose, at root, a sort of stretching of home, an expanded sense of home, and really, you know, thinking about home and dwelling and taking them really seriously in people's lives. But thank you, really helpful comments.
Who else would like to? Oh yeah, Micah.
Hi. Thank you very much for this. I think I want to, I have more something like a thought really, so it's not really a question, I apologize for that, but I've recently been talking to people about, and it's linked to this because when we were so separated from each other, there's always the question of how do we find connection, and then, you know, you have the digital technology of Zoom and being able to find connections in those ways. And recently I've been talking to people about how community is based on connections, but actually what happened with COVID is that this crisis that affected us all took away things that would have separated us beforehand, in the sense that we are connected by the fact that we find ourselves in a state of such crisis that all of us can't move regardless, and it's nothing to do with race or gender or class for at least a moment that happens. And it just made me think, because then Audrey talked about something quite personal, and I'll be linking that as well, but the death of someone. Well, my grandmother died as well a few years ago, and my mother couldn't visit her, no one could, but it wasn't because of COVID, it was simply lack of money to be able to visit because they live in an entirely different continent from their parents. And so I was just wondering about whether people talked about whether actually there wasn't a form of connection in terms of overcoming something, but finding ourselves in such, I guess, such shock together at the moment. Just something that occurred to me.
I think we found Annabelle might want to come in on this one as well. I don't know, in terms of your interviews, Annabelle. I'm just thinking, certainly, I mean, I think this came through certainly with some of the community organisations in particular places sort of working together, perhaps more than they had done previously, and supporting each other, and that was in London and Liverpool. But I think it's also, you know, there's sort of sense of, again, the limits to that in terms of the limits of the resourcing and so on. And that's another key thing we'd be recommending, is actually in terms of responding to a crisis like this, it's often grassroots local networks and organisations that can reach people most effectively and can communicate most effectively as well, but are significantly under-resourced. And the importance of actually the kind of coordination of that, as well as really valuing, you know, what is actually happening on the ground in terms of that immediacy of support. Annabelle, do you want to comment on this as well?
Yeah, thank you, Alison. I think so several participants did talk about this kind of collective sense of overcoming the shock or the grief, or the sense that for some of the time at least there was this sense of being in it together. But I think in my sense of it was relatively short-lived, and these kind of other inequalities very quickly came to the fore, and people were very aware of, you know, there was this rhetoric of we're all together, but the reality was often very different for people. So I think people were reflecting on that and the role of grassroots organisations in kind of stepping in where the state was often failing, and being very aware that there was a background to that as well in terms of the legacies of austerity and the impact of Brexit and other things going on at the same time. So yeah, I think people did want to kind of come together to support each other, and that was often done in very local ways, you know, neighbourhood level as well as family level. But I think your comment about not being able to visit at particular points of grief, I'm also reminded of an interview with somebody from a migrant background who said that for many people that was the kind of norm for them. You know, they couldn't necessarily visit, and obviously the pandemic has thrown that into relief for lots of other people, but we need to remember that that was the reality beforehand for many people as well. Yeah.
I'm terribly sorry, and I feel like a complete killjoy, but I think we probably will need to stop soon because the next part of the program begins at 15:50, and I'm aware it's 15:47. I hope that Alison and Annabelle will come perhaps tomorrow to the COVID discussion, which we have. One of our sessions is specifically on COVID, even though obviously all the sessions are equally interesting and relevant. But I think I'll have to draw this to a close with profound apologies. But I'd like to thank you in the normal ways very much for showing us, giving us a glimpse into the huge richness of the project you're doing and how interesting it is for everyone. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And please do follow our project on Twitter as well. It's, just Stay Home Stories is our name. And we've got loads of things on the website as well. So please do have a look at that. Lots more coming. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, bye. Some are staying and some are moving to the other one.
Thanks so much, Naomi.
Doing now for
Hi. Is this
I
session
just tried to
3A?
get there. Well, it will be, but sorry,
Oh.
3 what?
Hi, Robert. Hi, everybody.
Oh, hi, Madeline.
Hello.
Nice
Hi,
to
Ricardo.
Sorry, I've got to get out. I need to go to the other one, which I'm chairing, I think.
Bye-bye, Naomi.
Bye. Bye.
Bye,
God, this is so fraught. Right. Click here to join Zoom meeting.
I guess we're not recording this one, right? Hi, I'm Yang. I'm going to chair.
Oh,
it.
what?
Yeah.
Right.